All right, so picture this nearly 100 people getting arrested at Trump Tower.
Wow.
Yeah, and the reason a protest over the detention of an immigrant named Mahmoud Khalil.
Oh, wow.
You sent us the details on this, and we had to take a deep dive into this whole thing.
It's pretty wild when you think about it, that many people arrested at a place like Trump Tower, and all because of this one person's immigration situation.
Yeah, it's like all these different things colliding at once.
Totally. It's a
Ah,
really fascinating intersection of like protests, immigration policy, and even symbolic locations. Yeah.
absolutely. So that's exactly what we're going to do in this deep dive, unpack these mass arrests of these Jewish protesters at Trump Tower. They were there to rally for this guy, Mahmoud Khalil.
Right.
And we're going to base this whole thing on the information you gave us, to just try to understand if the government was actually justified in doing what they did. What were the arguments that the protesters were making? What were the authorities saying? And does this whole thing point to something bigger? Like, are protests and political tensions in the U.S. being handled differently now?
Yeah, that's a big question for sure.
It is a huge question. And our goal is to, you know, give you a clear view of all this, pull out the important stuff without completely overwhelming you.
I'll like to break it down.
Yeah, exactly. Break it down. So let's do this. Let's unpack all this. And the stuff you sent us, it really puts you right there in the middle of it.
It does. It really throws you into the immediate situation.
It
So you've
does.
got this big group of activists specifically identifying as Jewish.
Yeah.
They all converge on Trump Tower, and their goal was to protest the detention of this Mahmoud Khalil, who, according to what we've got, is facing possible deportation.
Right. And it wasn't like some, scattered
Yeah,
demonstration.
not at all. They were very focused.
It was targeted, very specific, and they were there for this one individual and what was happening to him. Yeah, and it seems like things escalated to the point where law enforcement had to step in, and they ended up arresting nearly 100 people.
Yeah, that's a serious response.
It is, and from what we can tell from the protester side of things, they feel like a government's immigration policies are inhumane.
Makes sense.
And they saw their demonstration as this demand for transparency and justice in Khalil's case.
Right, demanding answers and action.
Yeah, exactly. And then you look at it from the other side, from what the authorities were saying, and it sounds like they justified the arrests by pointing to the protesters disrupting public order.
So you've got these two totally different ways of looking at the same thing, right?
Exactly.
One side's emphasizing the right to protest against what they see as injustice, and the other's focusing on the government's duty to keep things peaceful and prevent chaos.
And this is where it gets really interesting because, like you said, it seems like Mahmoud Khalil's situation is what really set this whole thing off.
Yeah, he's like the catalyst.
Totally. And the material you sent it highlights how immigration has been this super controversial issue in the U.S. for a long time.
Oh, absolutely. It's been a hot button topic for years.
And it's clear that Khalil's detention has tapped into some really deep concerns. So from all the stuff you looked at, what was it about his case specifically that seems to have resonated so strongly with these protesters?
Well, it's interesting because there's a lot we don't know about Moms Khalil himself.
Really?
Yeah, the sources mentioned reports suggesting his detention was kind of shady, lacking transparency and all that. While activists are portraying him as a possible victim of really harsh policies, there are also these mentions of national security concerns, but they don't really go into detail.
Hmm.
So you've got this ambiguity surrounding why he was detained in the first place, and that seems to be the biggest point of contention.
So that lack of a clear explanation from the authorities about Khalil, that seems to be a big reason why those protests happened and why the reaction was so strong.
That makes sense, right?
It does, and it makes you think, if they had been more open about it from the beginning, could that have changed things?
Yeah.
Could it have prevented such a huge protest? What do you think about that connection between transparency and how much this whole thing escalated?
That is such a good question. And I think when official information is seen as missing or unclear, it creates room for people to come up with their own explanations, and that can make things even more tense.
Yeah, like people fill in the gaps with their own assumptions.
Exactly. And the sources you shared, they directly ask if the protest was a justified response to this lack of clarity, and maybe even more importantly, were there other ways to address those concerns before it got to mass arrests?
Right, were there other options on the table?
Yeah, and it makes you think about the message the government's reaction sends in a situation like this.
So let's get into that ethical side of it. Was the protest justified? Was the response justified? The material we have lays out the arguments from both sides.
Right, both perspectives.
And if the government's actions were justified, the main reasons seem to be the need to keep order in a busy place like Trump Tower.
Sure. Keeping things safe and under control.
Right, the risk that large protests could get out of hand, maybe even turn violent, and, the state's basic duty to enforce U.S. immigration laws. So, based on your review, how strong are those justifications compared to what we know about the protest itself?
Oh, those are definitely the usual justifications governments use when they're responding to protests that they see as disruptive.
Right, the classic argument.
Exactly. The core of it is that the state has to ensure everyone's safety and that public life can function without major interruptions.
Right, basic order and security.
But the thing is, and this is based on what you sent me,
Yeah.
we have to consider the context of this specific protest. Was it violent? Was it a clear threat to anyone, at least in the beginning? And what we suggested, it was peaceful. They were expressing a specific grievance.
Right, they had a clear message.
Yeah, so it raises the question of proportionality. Was a mass arrest the best way to initially respond?
That's a big question because then you have the protesters' point of view, which comes through in the sources too. And their argument is all about the lack of transparency surrounding Khalil's detention, the idea that silencing dissent is dangerous in a democracy.
Which is a powerful argument.
It is. And the fundamental right to hold the government accountable, to demand answers. So when you put those arguments up against the government's need for order, what stands out to you as the main point of conflict?
The biggest tension, I think, and it usually is in these kinds of situations in democracies, is that balance between freedom of speech and assembly, which are constitutional rights, and the government's legitimate interest in keeping the peace and public safety.
Right. Those two things can clash sometimes.
Yeah, and the sources you shared, they highlight this tension by asking, did the response, the nearly 100 arrests, match the level of disruption the protest was causing, especially if it was mainly about raising awareness about Khalil's situation and criticizing immigration policies more broadly?
Yeah. Was it too much?
Exactly. It makes us think about whether there were ways to de-escalate or engage with the protesters that weren't so forceful.
And that leads us to the bigger issue that seems to be simmering beneath the surface here, which the source material points to. And that's this growing feeling that the U.S. government is having trouble dealing with social and political unrest.
Right. It's like a broader trend.
Yeah. And the sources point to some key underlying factors contributing to this feeling, right?
They do. And one of the big ones is this significant political instability.
Instability.
Yeah. And that instability is fueled by deep divisions on a bunch of issues, everything from immigration policies to the integrity of elections.
And those divisions seem to be getting worse.
They do seem to be, and it creates this atmosphere of constant tension and a real erosion of trust between different groups in society and between the public and the government.
And that weakened trust in institutions, that seems especially important because if people feel like the government isn't listening to them or isn't being honest, then the sources suggest that it can lead to even more frustration and a higher chance of people turning to public demonstrations to make their voices heard.
Because they feel like they don't have any other options.
Exactly. And when those traditional ways of having a dialogue and participating in the system seem like they don't work anymore, then public protests can become the main way, and sometimes the only way people feel like they can express their disagreement and demand attention to specific issues.
It's a last resort in a way.
And there also seems to be this trend where protests that really challenge the status quo are met with a really strong response from law enforcement.
Yeah, show of force.
And that can create this negative cycle where things just keep escalating.
Definitely a vicious cycle.
So when we look at this whole situation at Trump Tower with Mahmoud Khalil's detention, what does it tell us based on all the material you looked at? It doesn't seem like just an isolated incident.
No, it doesn't.
It feels like a symptom of these bigger forces at play, this struggle to find the right balance between keeping things in order and upholding the right to protest.
I think that's a really important observation. You're connecting the dots between the specific event and the bigger picture. And I think the sources are suggesting that just making arrests, especially on a large scale, might stop a situation temporarily. But it doesn't solve the underlying problems that are pushing people to protest in the first place.
Right. It's addressing the symptoms, not the cause.
Exactly. And like we talked about, a heavy-handed response when there's no clear justification or transparency could actually make those underlying problems worse and make people trust the government even less.
And the material you reviewed, it also hints at the idea that there might be other approaches that could be more effective in the long run, like having more open and honest public discussions about controversial topics like immigration policies and specific cases like Khalil's.
Yeah, getting everything out in the open.
Do you think that could be a better way forward than just relying on law enforcement to intervene?
I think the sources are definitely pointing in that direction. that engaging in dialogue and trying to understand each other's perspectives could be a more sustainable way to deal with these complex issues.
It's about finding common ground.
Exactly. And they also suggest that maybe we need to take a hard look at the policies themselves, in this case, immigration enforcement, and see if they need to be changed to prevent these kinds of situations from happening in the first place.
To prevent things from getting to that boiling point.
Right. And then there's the question of whether this event and how the government handled it might actually lead to even bigger protests in the future.
Oh, wow, like a Whipple effect.
Exactly. History shows us that these kinds of events can be catalysts.
So we have a lot to think about here.
We do. The way a government responds to people expressing their disagreement can have a huge impact on how democracy functions.
For sure. And while keeping order is obviously important, the sources we looked at today really make us question whether mass arrests, especially when a protest seems to be peaceful and focused on demanding transparency, are the best way to go about things.
Yeah, are they really ethical, and do they really work in the long run?
Exactly. So thinking about everything we've talked about, what stands out to you about the ethics of protest and how the government should respond in this specific case?
Well, given all the unanswered questions about why Mahmoud Khalil was detained in the first place, does arresting all those protesters seem like a proportionate reaction to you?
I don't think so. I mean, if the protesters were mainly trying to bring attention to a potentially unjust situation and demand more transparency, meeting that with mass arrests just shuts down the conversation instead of encouraging it.
Right, it doesn't leave much room for dialogue.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder what message that sends about whether the government is willing to be held accountable and listen to people's concerns.
It's a good question, and thinking about those concerns about political instability and the lack of trust in institutions that we talked about earlier, what do you see as the long-term impact of this kind of event on public discourse and activism in the U.S.?
Well, it seems to me that when people feel like they're not being heard through the normal channels, and then they see peaceful protests being met with such a strong response, it could lead to more and more people feeling alienated and maybe even turning to more extreme forms of activism.
Yeah, they might feel like they have to take more drastic measures.
Right. It's like a dangerous cycle where distrust just grows and having a real conversation becomes almost impossible.
It's a worrying trend, and given that we still don't have the full story about why Mahmoud Khalil was detained, what does that lack of transparency say about the current climate around immigration enforcement and how information is shared in those cases?
The fact that there's so much secrecy around Khalil's case is really concerning because in a healthy democracy, people need to be able to access information about what the government is doing that's crucial for trust.
Transparency is key.
It is.
Uh,
And when the reasons for someone's detention are unclear, especially when it comes to immigration, which is already such a sensitive issue, it can create a lot of suspicion and fear in communities.
Absolutely. It can make people feel like they're being kept in the dark.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder what else might be being hidden and what that means for accountability and whether the public can really keep an eye on these processes.
Yeah, those are questions we need to keep